I hadn't eaten in 2 days. My last piece of bread was supposed to keep me alive, until she walked in. The rain had stopped just an hour ago, but the street still smelled of wet dust and rust. The sky was the color of cold ash, heavy with clouds that hadn't decided whether to stay or leave. I sat on the broken wooden bench inside a small roadside shelter, the kind meant to shield you from the sun during the day, but never quite keeping the rain away. In my hands was the last thing I had left in the world that could be called food, a single piece of bread, not soft, not fresh, stale, edges hardened like stone. But in that moment, it was all that stood between me and the kind of hunger that gnaws at your insides until you forget what full even feels like. My name is Daniel, 31 years old, a junior clerk at a company that's been delaying salaries for 3 months. My tiny rented room, barely big enough to stretch my legs, was months behind on rent. The landlord's voice still echoed in my ears from last night. His warning that I had 7 days before he threw me and my belongings into the street. I hadn't told anyone at work how bad things had gotten. Pride is a strange thing. Even when you're starving, you try to hide it. My pantry was empty, except for this bread, which I'd been saving since yesterday evening. It was supposed to be my breakfast, lunch, and dinner all in one. I took it out slowly from the plastic wrap, my fingers brushing over the rough surface. I could already imagine how it would taste. Dry, maybe a little bitter, but filling enough to keep my knees from shaking when I walked. Just as I was about to take my first bite, I heard footsteps approaching the shelter. Slow, unsteady, dragging across the wet pavement. I looked up. A woman stood at the entrance, her hands gripping the wooden post like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked lost. Not in the way someone does when they can't find a street, but lost in a deeper, heavier sense, like she hadn't found herself in a very long time. Her clothes weren't ragged, but they weren't fresh either. A plain beige coat with a missing button, dark trousers damp from the rain, and shoes that had clearly walked more miles than they were made for. Her hair clung to her forehead in wet strands, and her face was pale. Not the kind of pale that comes from light skin, but the pale that comes from exhaustion, from hunger, from being out in the cold for too long. Her eyes scanned the shelter, then stopped on me, or rather on the bread in my hands. I don't know why, but my grip tightened around it. Something inside me, call it survival instinct, whispered, "Don't share. You haven't eaten in 2 days. This is all you have." She stepped in, slowly, as if testing whether she was welcome. She didn't say anything, just lowered herself to sit on the opposite bench. The way she moved told me she hadn't had a proper meal in a while, the small wince as she bent her knees, the way her shoulders slumped as soon as she sat down. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the distant drip of rainwater falling from the roof into a rusty bucket in the corner. I looked down at the bread again. My mouth was dry, my stomach twisting itself into knots, but now there was another knot forming in my chest. She looked defeated, and for reasons I still don't fully understand, I couldn't bring myself to just take a bite while she sat there, empty-handed. I tried to push the thought away. I reminded myself of my empty room, of the landlord's warning, of the long walk to work every day, because I couldn't afford the bus fare anymore. I reminded myself that no one had been offering me free meals when I was hungry. But then, she looked at me again, not in a pleading way, not like a beggar asking for alms. Her eyes had no request in them, and that was the problem. They just looked tired, resigned, as if she'd already stopped expecting kindness from anyone. And somehow, that hurt more than if she had asked. I swallowed hard. My fingers loosened, and before my mind could stop me, I held out the bread. "It's not much," I said, my voice rough, "but it's yours if you want it." For a moment she just stared at it, then at me, as if trying to decide whether I was serious. You're giving me your food?" she asked quietly. I nodded, forcing a small smile. "I can cook again when I get home." That was a lie, of course. There was nothing left to cook. She hesitated for a second, then reached out with both hands, taking the bread as if it were something fragile and priceless. "Thank you," she said, but not the casual "thank you" you give a cashier. It was deliberate, slow, almost formal, like each word was being weighed before leaving her lips. As she held the bread, she looked at it for a moment before taking a small bite. She chewed slowly, as if savoring not just the taste, but the act of eating itself. I watched her in silence, trying to convince myself I'd done the right thing. My stomach growled in protest, but there was a strange warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in months. When she'd eaten half, she paused and looked at me. "You should have kept it," she said softly. I shook my head. "You needed it." Something flickered in her eyes then, something I couldn't quite name, a mix of curiosity, gratitude, and something else. She stood, brushing the crumbs from her coat. Then she looked at me and said the words that would stay in my mind for days. "We will meet again. Very soon." Before I could respond, she stepped out into the street, her figure disappearing into the misty air. I sat there for a long time, staring at the space where she'd stood, wondering who she was, and why it felt like her promise wasn't just empty politeness. Little did I know, the next time I saw her, she wouldn't just be a stranger. She'd be sitting in the CEO's office, and I'd be standing in front of her, not as a man with bread, but as a man fighting for his job. Something about her eyes told me she wasn't who she seemed. The shelter felt unusually still after she left. The usual rustle of paper wrappers, the hum of traffic, and the occasional cough from a passerby all seemed distant, as if muffled under an invisible blanket. I stayed seated on the old wooden bench, elbows resting on my knees, staring at the wet patch of ground where she had been sitting just moments ago. Her voice still echoed in my head. "We will meet again. Very soon." They weren't the sort of words you tossed out casually, not in that tone. It wasn't a friendly goodbye. It was a statement. No, more like a promise, the kind that didn't leave room for doubt. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to recall every detail of her face. The pale skin that seemed untouched by the grime of the streets, the slight hollowness around her cheeks, and most of all, those eyes. Sharp, steady, and searching. They didn't flinch, didn't dart around like most people avoiding attention. Instead, they looked straight through you, peeling away whatever masks you thought you had. There was focus there, not the desperate focus of survival that I'd seen in others who'd been living rough. This was different, controlled, almost calculated, like she was studying more than just my face. And then there was the odd detail that refused to leave my mind. Her hands. For someone who claimed she hadn't eaten in 2 days, her hands were remarkably clean. No ingrained dirt in the nails, no cracks or raw patches on the skin. Her fingers were slim, nails neatly trimmed, and there was even a faint sheen, like someone who'd washed with proper soap that morning. I had noticed it in the moment but brushed it aside, telling myself it could be from a better time in her life, maybe a habit she refused to let go of. But then, there was that watch. I had only caught a quick glimpse when she reached for the bread, the cuff of her sleeve sliding back just enough to reveal it. Black leather strap, gold-rimmed face, minimalist but undeniably expensive. Even without knowing brands, I could tell it wasn't something you bought in a street market. It was subtle, but it didn't belong with the rest of her worn clothes. I tried to shake it off, blaming my curiosity on an overactive imagination. But deep down, the unease stayed. Outside, the drizzle had started again, that fine mist that clung to your skin and left everything smelling faintly of wet concrete. I pulled my jacket tighter and prepared to leave, thinking I'd spend the rest of the day trying to stretch what little I had left in my wallet. That's when I heard it, the soft tread of footsteps returning. I looked up, and my pulse skipped. She was back. "You didn't leave," she said, as if it were both a question and an observation. Had nowhere to go just yet, I replied, forcing my tone into something casual, even though my heart had sped up. She stepped inside, fully, pulling the dampness of the outside air with her, and took the seat opposite me. The bread, my bread, was still in her hand, though half of it was gone now. She studied me with that same unblinking focus, like I was a puzzle she'd been piecing together in her mind. "What do you do for work, Daniel?" she asked without any preamble. I blinked. It wasn't the kind of question strangers usually asked, especially not in a place like this. "I'm a junior clerk at a trading company," I said. "Mostly paperwork, filing, sorting, that sort of thing." She tilted her head slightly, as if assessing whether the answer matched whatever she had guessed. "Do you like it?" The question caught me off guard. Nobody had asked me that in years. Most people just wanted to know what you did, not how you felt about it. "It pays the bills," I said, and even to my own ears, the words sounded thin. Her lips curved faintly, not quite a smile. "Does it? Pay the bills, I mean." I looked away, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. Somehow, in the space of a few minutes, she had pulled aside the curtain I usually kept closed. "And your life goals?" she asked next. "What do you want beyond this job?" I hesitated. The answer stuck somewhere between my mind and my mouth. "I haven't thought about it much lately." "That's dangerous," she said softly, more to herself than to me. "A man with no goals will accept any kind of cage." The words hit me in a way I wasn't ready for. I frowned slightly. "You talk like someone who knows about cages." Her eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second, but she didn't answer. Instead, she leaned back, folding her arms as she continued watching me. "You seem observant," she said after a moment, "but you don't look like you believe you deserve more than what you have." It wasn't an insult. It was worse. It was true. I opened my mouth to ask her who she really was, but she stood up before I could form the words. Pulling her coat tighter around herself, she said, "Thank you for the bread. That will not be forgotten." And with that, she turned and walked out into the drizzle again, leaving me sitting there with more questions than I'd had that morning. That night, her words wouldn't leave me alone. "What do you want beyond this job?" Lying on my narrow bed in my cramped, peeling-walled room, I stared at the ceiling, the sound of rain tapping against the tin roof. I thought about the watch, the clean hands, the confidence in her voice. I thought about how her gaze had felt, not judgmental, but weighing, as though she'd been quietly measuring the limits of my ambition. She was too composed to be just another lost soul on the street, but if she wasn't who she appeared to be, then who was she? The question gnawed at me all night. The next morning, with barely 4 hours of restless sleep behind me, I dragged myself toward the glass front building of the trading company. Coffee in one hand, satchel in the other, I was rehearsing how to get through another day of monotonous filing when I froze, mid-step. Through the gleaming glass doors, I saw her. The woman from the shelter. Only now she wasn't hunched against the cold or clutching a piece of bread. She was walking across the lobby with long, confident strides, a security pass clipped neatly to her coat. A receptionist greeted her with a nod of recognition, and as I stood rooted to the spot in the drizzle, one thought crashed through my mind, like a tidal wave. She works here. I froze. The woman I fed yesterday was walking into my company like she owned it. The drizzle outside had been clinging to my jacket all morning, soaking into the collar until the fabric felt heavy against my skin. I had been thinking only about getting inside, grabbing a coffee, and burying myself in routine. But the second I looked up at the glass-paneled entrance of our company's lobby, every other thought scattered like leaves in the wind. So there she was. Same beige coat, same high cheekbones, pale from the winter air. Same eyes, the ones that had looked straight through me yesterday, pulling thoughts out of me I hadn't even realized I'd buried. But today, something was different. Yesterday, she'd looked like a woman bracing herself against the world, shoulders slightly hunched, steps careful, as if the pavement might give way beneath her. Today, she moved with precision, not hurried, not hesitant. Every stride had a weight to it, like she knew exactly where she was going and exactly who would be waiting for her. For a moment, I wondered if exhaustion had made me hallucinate. Maybe my mind was stitching together two different women into one image. But the sight of the receptionist leaping from her seat erased that doubt instantly. Through the glass, I could see her posture change the moment the woman approached. Chin lifted, back straight, hand smoothing over her desk as if tidying a throne before a queen arrived. "Good morning, ma'am." "Welcome," the receptionist said, her voice carrying even through the muffled barrier of the glass. "Ma'am, not miss, not Mrs. Ma'am," spoken with the crisp, deliberate respect you reserve for people whose approval could shift your career's trajectory overnight. The woman gave a single polite nod. She didn't smile, but she didn't need to. It was the kind of acknowledgement that carried its own quiet authority. Something twisted in my chest. My thoughts scrambled for answers. Was she a high-value client? An investor? Someone from a partner company? Then Mr. Collins appeared. Our floor manager, the man famous for rarely leaving his office unless he smelled trouble, was striding across the polished marble like his shoes were on fire. In all my years here, I'd never seen him move with that kind of urgency. He straightened his tie twice, smoothed back his thinning hair, and plastered on a smile I'd only seen during bonus announcements. From my spot just outside the doorway, I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need words to read the scene. Collins was leaning in ever so slightly, nodding at intervals, his hands moving in a subtle, "please this way" gesture toward the elevators that led to the executive floor. The woman responded with that same calm assurance, her gaze steady, her steps unhurried. She was in no rush to prove herself. She didn't have to. They disappeared down the corridor that led to the restricted section, the one where access required both a key card and an invitation. At the end of that hallway was a single door, the CEO's office. My pulse began to drum in my ears. The CEO's office was a place most employees only saw in passing, the stuff of whispered stories and corporate folklore. People went in there for two reasons: to sign something monumental, or to be told their services were no longer needed. And now she, the woman who had been eating my last piece of bread in a damp shelter yesterday, was walking in as though she had the keys to the building. I stood there in the drizzle for a full minute, coffee cooling in my hand. My mind spun in loops, replaying yesterday over and over. How did she know the CEO? Why had she said nothing? And if she was this important, why had she been sitting in that shelter at all? A darker thought slid in, uninvited. Had she been testing me? I finally forced myself to step inside. The warmth of the lobby hit me first, the faint scent of polished wood and citrus cleaner, the hum of the heating system overhead. But it felt different now, almost charged, like the air had absorbed some of her presence. Even the receptionist's behavior was off. Normally, she tossed me a distracted "morning" while juggling phone calls. Today, she just gave a quick nod, her eyes flicking toward the hallway she'd disappeared down. I walked to my desk, weaving between co-workers who all seemed to be whispering more than usual. My chair creaked as I sat, but the sound barely registered. My mind was still upstairs, the gold-rimmed watch under her sleeve, the way she'd asked me about my life goals, the way she'd said, "We will meet again. Very soon." Hours blurred. I typed half-heartedly, filed documents that I barely read, and nodded at people whose names I momentarily forgot. Every so often, I'd glance toward the elevator, convinced I'd see her stepping out. She never did. By lunch, the rumor mill was in full swing. In the break room, two finance assistants huddled near the coffee machine, their voices low, but urgent. "Did you see the woman Collins took upstairs?" one asked. "Yeah, she's someone. Big. CEO cleared his whole schedule for her." The other frowned. "Cleared his schedule?" "For a visitor." That's what I heard. Think she's from the board. Maybe. Or higher than the board? The phrase lodged in my brain like a splinter. I kept my head down, pretending to scroll through my phone, but every word they spoke was fuel for my already restless thoughts. The rest of the afternoon crawled by, each tick of the clock pulling me closer to a place I didn't want to go. The edge of needing answers. Because now it wasn't just curiosity. It was unease. Yesterday she'd looked vulnerable, a little lost even. Today, she carried herself like someone used to power. And in a company like ours, sudden shifts in presence meant only one thing. Something big was happening behind closed doors. By 5 p.m., I was ready to leave. My head ached from the tension of holding in my questions, and my body felt heavier than it had that morning. All I wanted was the anonymity of my small rented room, the comfort of being invisible. But just as I reached for my bag, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. 2 people were walking toward my desk, the HR manager, Ms. Lawson, and one of her assistants. Their expressions were neutral, professional, but there was a tightness around their eyes that told me this wasn't a casual visit. "Daniel," Miss Lawson said, her voice calm but firm. "Yes?" My reply sounded too light, almost rehearsed. "The boss wants to see you." For a second, I just stared at her. The boss? The CEO? In 7 years, I had never once been summoned to that office. And now the only thing I could picture was her, sitting in that room, perhaps waiting for me. Was this about yesterday? About the bread? Or was I walking straight into something I couldn't yet imagine? My heart pounded as the elevator climbed. Why would the CEO want to see me? The moment the HR manager's words hit me, "The boss wants to see you," my body seemed to stop working properly. My first thought was that she had made a mistake. My second thought was that she hadn't. The boss in our company meant one man, the CEO, and the CEO didn't see junior clerks like me unless something extraordinary, and usually unpleasant, had happened. I followed her toward the elevators, my legs stiff, my mind rattling like loose change in a tin. I tried to replay my last week, scanning for anything I might have done wrong. A missed file, a misplaced invoice, an email sent to the wrong person. Nothing jumped out. When we reached the elevator, she gave me a polite nod and stepped back, leaving me to go up alone. The doors slid shut behind me with a sound that felt more like a vault ceiling than a regular elevator. The ride began with a soft hum, the faint vibration under my feet, a reminder that I was being carried toward somewhere I had never been. The panel above the doors ticked off the floors one by one. 4, 5, 6. With each passing number, my heartbeat grew louder in my ears. My reflection in the brushed steel of the elevator doors looked pale, eyes too wide. I loosened my tie, but it didn't help. I had never been to the top floor. No one from my level had. It was the kind of place you only heard about in stories. Polished, quiet, intimidating. Deals worth more than my lifetime salary were signed there. People wore suits tailored to perfection, shoes that never saw a drop of dust. Now I was going to walk right into that world, unprepared and uninvited. By the time the panel lit up 10, 11, 12, I could feel sweat gathering at the back of my neck. The air inside the elevator seemed to grow cooler the higher I went, but my body was warm with nerves. Finally, the soft ding announced my arrival. The doors opened to reveal a hallway that felt like stepping into another reality. The carpet was thick enough that I couldn't hear my own footsteps. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany with subtle gold trim. Soft lighting glowed from fixtures that looked like pieces of art rather than lamps. It didn't smell like the rest of the building. Down below, there was always the faint scent of ink, paper, and stale coffee. Up here, the air carried a faint mix of sandalwood and something sharper, expensive. At the far end of the corridor was a large, curved desk. The The woman sitting there was the CEO's personal receptionist, someone I'd only seen from a distance in the rare moments she visited our floor. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfectly arranged, not a single thing out of place. Her eyes lifted as I approached. At first, her face showed polite professionalism. Then something flickered across her features. "Daniel?" she asked, her tone holding the tiniest hint of surprise. "Yes," I managed. My voice sounded smaller than I'd intended. She pressed a button on her desk phone. "He's here." Then she paused and added, "Yes, ma'am." Ma'am. That word hit me like a jolt. In an instant, yesterday's memory flashed. The receptionist downstairs calling her ma'am, the way people seemed to straighten in her presence. She set the phone down and gave me a small nod. "You can go in." The double doors to the CEO's office were tall and heavy, made of dark wood that gleamed under the lights. I placed my hand on the brass handle and hesitated for half a breath, as if part of me still hoped this was some strange misunderstanding. Then I pushed. The doors opened silently, and I stepped inside. The office was vast. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city skyline, the late afternoon light spilling across a desk the size of a small dining table. The carpet was so plush it felt like walking on fabric instead of floor. And there she was. Not the CEO, not any executive I recognized. Her, the woman from the shelter. She was sitting behind the CEO's desk, one elbow resting casually on the arm of the chair, her fingers curled loosely as if she'd been waiting for me. The gold-rimmed watch peeked from under her sleeve again, catching the sunlight. If she was surprised to see me, she didn't show it. Instead, a calm smile touched her lips, the kind that could either welcome you or dismantle you, depending on her mood. "Daniel," she said warmly, as though greeting an old friend. For a second, I couldn't move. My mind was trying to reconcile two completely incompatible images. Her in the shelter yesterday, coat damp, eyes sharp but weary. And her here, framed by the skyline, as if the entire room bent subtly around her presence. She gestured toward the leather chair opposite her. "Please sit." I crossed the room slowly, my senses hyper-aware of everything. The faint tick of a clock somewhere behind me, the scent of polished wood, the distant hum of the city through the glass. The chair was cold under my hands as I lowered myself into it. "You're wondering why you're here," she said, studying me with those same calculating eyes that had unsettled me yesterday. "That would be one way to put it," I replied. She leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving mine. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." "More than a few." Her smile widened a fraction. "We'll get to them. But first, I want to thank you." "For what?" "For yesterday. For sharing what little you had without asking for anything in return." I swallowed, unsure whether to feel flattered or uneasy. She continued, "It's rare. This city teaches people to keep, to guard, to measure every kindness in terms of what they might get back. You didn't do that. You just gave." Her voice was steady, her words deliberate. But there was a weight in them that made me feel like she was telling me more than she was actually saying. I opened my mouth, but she raised a hand slightly, stopping me. "There's something you should understand," she said. "What happened yesterday? It wasn't by accident." I blinked. "You mean?" I was there for a reason. And now, you're here for a reason." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the faint hum of the building's ventilation. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the desk. The watch caught the light again, almost intentionally. Her gaze locked on mine with a calm intensity. "Daniel, we need to talk about your future." She let the sentence hang for a moment, then added, "And mine." The words seemed to echo in the room, even after she'd stopped speaking. My mind raced. What future? What did my life have to do with hers? And why did I have the unsettling feeling that whatever she was about to say would change everything I thought I knew? Her words didn't sound like a CEO's. They sounded like a challenge. I stared at her across the expanse of polished wood between us. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She just let her last sentence. "We need to talk about your future. And mine." Hang there, heavy and deliberate, until I felt its weight pressing against my ribs. When she finally spoke again, her tone was calm, measured, the way you might address someone you've already decided is important. "Daniel," she began, "do you know how often I meet my employees outside of work?" I shook my head slowly. "Never?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Almost never. But sometimes." She leaned back in the chair, her gaze drifting briefly toward the skyline beyond the glass. "Sometimes I need to see who they are when the nameplate is gone. When the uniform, the title, the paycheck, all of it, is stripped away." Her eyes returned to mine. "It tells me more than any resume ever could." I felt a strange chill run through me. "You were testing me." "In a way," she said, "though I didn't plan our meeting. That part was chance. But once it happened, I decided to see how you would respond. I thought of the shelter, the drizzle, the last piece of bread in my hand. And you? Go undercover?" Her smile deepened. "More often than people would guess. Sometimes I walk into one of my restaurants as an ordinary customer. Sometimes I sit in the back of a warehouse during a shift change. And yes, sometimes I visit places where no one would expect to find a CEO. She said the letters, CEO, like they were just another word. Nothing special, but I felt the air shift at their weight. I sat back, still trying to process it all. "Why?" "Because titles make people behave differently," she said simply. "If I walk into a room and everyone knows who I am, I get the polished version of them, the performance. But if I'm just another face in the crowd, I see the truth. And truth, Daniel, is rare." The way she said my name made it sound like both a compliment and a warning. She rose from the chair, moving toward the tall windows. The city stretched endlessly beyond the glass, its streets crawling with cars like veins carrying the lifeblood of a restless machine. "When I met you yesterday," she continued, "you didn't just give me food. You gave me the last of what you had, without hesitation, without even asking my name." I started to speak, but she turned, holding up a hand to stop me. "Do you know how rare that is? Most people, even good people, measure kindness like currency. They weigh what they have against what they might lose. You didn't." I felt heat rising to my face, unsure whether it was pride or discomfort. "I've been searching for someone," she said, returning to her seat. "Not for the company's usual roles. This is different." Her tone shifted, losing some of its warmth. "It's a position that doesn't exist on any organizational chart. There's no job posting for it, no salary scale, no title that would make sense to anyone outside this room." My mind churned with questions I didn't dare voice yet. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "I need someone I can trust beyond the limits of policy and protocol. Someone who will speak the truth even when it's inconvenient. Someone who will see what others miss. Not just numbers and reports, but people, their motives, their tells." It felt like she was describing someone else, someone far more qualified than me. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself. Her gaze didn't waver. "Because you passed the only test that matters to me. When no one was watching, and when you had something to lose, you still chose to give." For a moment, the only sound was the soft tick of the clock on the far wall. She opened a drawer and pulled out a plain folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No logo, no company letterhead. Just a brief paragraph and a signature line at the bottom. The words were vague, deliberately so. They spoke of special assignments, discretion, and direct reporting. "This," she said, tapping the paper lightly, "is an offer. It will put you outside the standard chain of command. You'll answer only to me. You'll have access to places and information most people here don't even know exist. My eyes scanned the page again, trying to make sense of it. And what exactly would I be doing? Her smile returned, smaller now. That depends on what I need. Sometimes it will be business. Sometimes it will be personal. Always, it will require trust. I looked up sharply. Personal? She didn't elaborate. The room felt quieter, as if even the hum of the city had faded. I sat there with the folder open in front of me, the weight of her gaze like a second document I had to read. I'm not asking for an answer now, she said finally. You have until tomorrow. There was something final in her tone, as if tomorrow was a line in the sand, and whatever came after it would be unchangeable. And if I say no? I asked carefully. Her eyes softened, but only slightly. Then nothing changes. You'll go back to your desk, back to the reports and the filing. You'll stay in your lane. And maybe, years from now, you'll wonder what might have been, and if I say yes. She leaned back, folding her hands in front of her. The sunlight caught the gold rim of her watch again, almost like a cue in a play. If you say yes, she said quietly, everything changes. The words seemed to hang in the air long after she'd spoken them. Everything changes. I closed the folder slowly, my mind caught between the safety of the life I knew and the shadowy outline of something far larger, far riskier. Tomorrow suddenly felt too close and impossibly far away. Why would a millionaire trust me with something she wouldn't tell anyone else? The ride back from her office felt longer than it should have. The streets blurred past the taxi window, but my mind wasn't in the city anymore. It was locked inside that conversation with her. The CEO, the woman I had met in a damp roadside shelter less than 48 hours ago. She'd sat across from me in her office with the same calm expression, but the words she'd spoken had carved themselves deep into my thoughts. There's something I want you to do. Something I can't trust anyone else with. I had nodded politely then, too stunned to respond properly, and she had simply said she'd give me the night to decide. Now, in the quiet hum of the taxi, the weight of it pressed harder. Why me? I wasn't special. I was a junior clerk who shuffled papers and filed invoices. I didn't have connections, influence, or even enough savings to pay rent on time. And yet, she had looked at me like I was the answer to a question she'd been asking for a long time. It didn't make sense. By the time I reached my apartment, the drizzle had turned into a light rain. I climbed the narrow stairs, the wood creaking under my feet, and let myself into my single-room flat. The air inside was stale, heavy with the faint smell of old cooking oil from the shared kitchen downstairs. I hung my jacket on the back of the chair and sat on the edge of the bed. The springs sagged under my weight. It was ridiculous. I'd barely spoken to her for more than an hour in total, yet she was in my head like a song I couldn't turn off. I replayed her words, her measured tone, her eyes when she said, "Say yes, and everything changes." Changes how? I stood and paced the room, the floorboards creaking with each step. Every scenario I imagined was worse than the last. Maybe it was some elaborate test. Maybe she was setting me up. Maybe she wanted a pawn in some corporate game I didn't understand. Or maybe... I stopped at the window, looking out over the dim streetlights below. Maybe she was telling the truth. The thought scared me more than the lies. I needed another voice in my head besides my own. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I trusted with something like this. Marcus. He answered on the second ring. Dan. You sound weird. I need to talk. In person. He didn't argue. 15 minutes later, we were sitting in the corner booth of a rundown cafe 2 streets away. The smell of burnt coffee clung to the air, and the rain pattered softly against the window beside us. I told him everything, from the shelter to the bread, to seeing her in the company lobby, to the meeting in her office. I didn't spare a single detail. When I was done, he leaned back and whistled softly. Man, you've either stepped into the luckiest break of your life or the biggest trap you'll ever see. Yeah, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. That's the problem. I don't know which one it is, Marcus drummed his fingers on the table. What exactly is she offering you? She didn't say everything, just that it's not a normal company role, something outside the official hierarchy, and that it requires trust. He raised an eyebrow. Trust, huh? That word cuts both ways. She's either pulling you in because she sees something in you, or because she needs someone disposable. I winced. Thanks for the encouragement. I'm serious, Dan. Look, you grew up like me. We both know what happens when rich people get bored. They play games, and those games chew up guys like us. I didn't have an argument. He wasn't wrong. But something about her, her voice, her eyes, told me she wasn't bored. She was searching. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay on my bed, staring at the cracks in the ceiling, the sound of rain on the roof mixing with the low hum of the streetlights outside. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her in two versions, the shivering stranger in the shelter and the poised CEO behind her desk. Which one was real? Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat up. My mind wandered back, uninvited, to the years before all this. The lean years. I remembered nights as a teenager when the fridge at home was empty, when my mother would pretend she wasn't hungry, so I could eat the last piece of bread. I remembered the humiliation of wearing the same faded shirt to school 3 days in a row, of walking past shop windows and catching my own reflection, thin, tired, and pretending not to care. Back then, every opportunity felt like a locked door, and every door had someone on the other side who didn't think people like me belonged there. And now, someone was holding a door open. I didn't know what was behind it, but I knew what it felt like to turn away from a chance and spend the rest of your life wondering, what if? By morning, my decision was made. I showered, shaved, and dressed for work, though I couldn't shake the strange anticipation crawling under my skin. My phone was on the table, screen dark, waiting. At 9:13 a.m., it buzzed, one new message, from her. I unlocked it quickly. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a line of text and a dropped pin on a map. 3 p.m. today. Don't be late. And Daniel, this isn't the office. I stared at the screen for a long moment, the tiny blinking location marker pulsing like a heartbeat. She wasn't taking me back to the company. Whatever this was, it was starting somewhere else entirely. And my gut told me that once I stepped into that place, there would be no going back. This wasn't an office. It was a mansion. I had expected an industrial warehouse, maybe an old office building, something that fit the secrecy of her text. I was wrong. The car slowed as the road narrowed, and up ahead I saw gates, tall black iron gates with ornate designs, flanked by stone pillars. 2 men in dark uniforms stood on either side, hands clasped in front, but their stance was military, not casual. And I didn't miss the slight bulge under their jackets. Security, armed and ready. The gates swung open slowly, like they had all the time in the world, and the car eased forward onto a smooth, stone-paved driveway. I leaned slightly to the window, taking it in. On either side, the grass was cut so precisely it could have been trimmed with scissors. Manicured hedges stood in symmetrical rows, and beyond them, flowering trees dotted the property like deliberate brush strokes on a painting. And then, I saw the cars. A line of them parked along the right side of the driveway. Black sedans that gleamed like mirrors, a white Rolls-Royce that looked untouched by dust, and, my breath caught, a deep red sports car, with curves so sharp, it looked like it was built to break speed limits for fun. I didn't know much about luxury vehicles, but even I could tell I was looking at the kind of price tags that could buy entire apartment buildings. We rounded a bend, and the house came into full view. Calling it a house felt like calling the ocean a puddle. White marble walls reflected the late afternoon sun, Towering glass panels stretched across its front like eyes watching the world, and a balcony wrapped around the second floor in a seamless curve. The kind of architecture you saw in glossy magazines, owned by people whose names appeared on Forbes lists. The car stopped in front of a wide stone staircase leading to double doors. The doors themselves were works of art, dark wood with gold inlays, the handles shaped like twisting vines. I was still staring when the front door opened, and there she was. Not in the sharp suit from the office, not even in the long coat she wore in the shelter. She was dressed casually, fitted jeans, a soft gray sweater, her hair pulled back loosely. She looked younger like this, but there was still that air about her, the kind of presence that filled a space without needing to raise a voice. "Daniel," she said, smiling faintly. "Come in." Her voice was warm, but my steps were cautious. The marble beneath my shoes was cool, polished so well I could see faint reflections. Inside, the space opened into a wide hallway, ceilings soaring above me, light streaming through a skylight. Paintings lined the walls, not prints, but the kind that belonged in private collections, each with its own small spotlight. To the left, a lounge with deep leather chairs and a grand piano. To the right, a dining room with a table long enough to seat 20. Somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear the muted hum of something mechanical, maybe central climate control or hidden machinery. She led me past it all without slowing, her steps light but assured. I followed, trying not to feel out of place, though every part of me did. We passed a room that looked like a private library, its walls lined with books, the scent of old paper spilling into the hallway. Another room appeared to be a study, with a mahogany desk and shelves of neatly arranged binders. But we didn't stop until we reached a door at the far end of the hall. It was different from the others, reinforced, with a discreet keypad and a biometric scanner just above the handle. Without a word, she pressed her thumb to the scanner. A soft click followed. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. I followed, and stopped. It wasn't an office. It was a war room. The walls were covered in large boards pinned with papers, photos, and diagrams connected by strings of colored thread. On one side, floor-to-ceiling shelving held stacks of files, some marked "Confidential" in bold red. 2 large desks dominated the center, both covered with open folders, maps, and tablets displaying graphs and figures. A flat screen on the far wall showed a rotating display of financial data and news headlines. She closed the door behind us, the sound final, sealing us inside this private world. "This," she said, walking to one of the desks, "is where I work when I can't afford anyone else seeing." I stayed near the door, my eyes darting from document to document, catching fragments, stock charts, email printouts, photographs of men in suits shaking hands. She looked at me over her shoulder. "You can step closer, Daniel." "I invited you here for a reason." I walked slowly to the desk, feeling the weight of the air in the room. The papers weren't random. They told a story, one of tension, betrayal, and something closing in. She tapped a folder and slid it toward me. "This company, our company, is under attack." I frowned, flipping the folder open. Inside were copies of internal memos, strategy drafts, and a list of board members. "From who?" "From within," she said simply. She moved to the board, pointing at several photos. 3 of my top executives have been feeding information to competitors. Slowly, carefully, but enough to undermine us. Contracts have been leaked. Clients have been approached before we can finalize deals. It's death by 1,000 cuts. I looked at the faces in the photos. People I'd seen in the building, always far above my level. Men and women in expensive suits, smiling for the camera. "Why not just fire them?" I asked. Her eyes darkened. "I can't move until I have proof that will hold up in court. If I act too soon, they'll paint me as paranoid and use the board against me. I have one chance to strike, and I need to know exactly where the rot ends." She turned to me fully now, her expression unreadable. "I've been watching you since before the shelter." That made me blink. Watching me. I make it my business to know who works for me, not just on paper, but in reality. You've been overlooked, Daniel. No scandals, no office politics. You do your job. You keep your head down, and you don't play games. People like that can move without being noticed. I didn't know whether to feel flattered or unsettled. She continued, "I can't use my usual security team. They're too visible, too expected. I need someone invisible to them, someone who can walk through the building and not raise a single suspicion." I looked down at the papers again, the complexity of it all pressing against me. This wasn't just a company dispute. This was power, millions at stake, reputations on the line. "And you want me to—" "What?" I asked carefully. Her voice dropped. "I want you to gather information for me. Watch, listen, collect proof. I'll give you access to certain files, and you'll report only to me. No one else can know." The room felt even smaller now, the walls pressing in with the weight of her request. "That's risky," I said, my voice lower than before. She nodded. "For both of us. But without this, Daniel, we could both be out of a job. Or worse." The silence stretched. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. She took a step closer, her gaze locking with mine. There was no performance in her eyes now. No mysterious glint. No playful challenge. Just something raw, honest, and heavy with consequence. She leaned forward slightly, her words slow and deliberate. "You're the only one I can trust with this." I thought she wanted my loyalty. Turns out she needed my courage. The room still smelled faintly of polished wood and leather when she slid the thick envelope across the desk toward me. It wasn't just the weight of paper I felt when I picked it up. It was the heaviness of something unseen, like holding a stone plucked from the bottom of a deep river. "I need you to deliver this," she said, her voice steady, but quieter than before. "Directly to Harold Mensah. No one else." Her eyes stayed on mine, searching for, I don't know, hesitation maybe. "Who is he?" I asked. "An old friend of the company. Someone who's stood by us for more than a decade. Right now, the board is trying to pull him to their side. If they succeed, we lose control." I glanced at the envelope. "And this will stop them. It will remind him where his loyalties belong," she said simply. Then she leaned forward, her tone sharpening. "But Daniel, you can't tell anyone you're doing this. Not even people inside the company. Especially not people inside the company." That last part sent a chill up my spine. "Why me?" I asked. Her lips twitched, almost into a smile. "Because they won't see you coming." The sky outside was heavy with gray when I left the mansion. One of her drivers was waiting with the engine running. No escort, no security detail. Just me and a man who didn't say a word when I got in. The city's hum swallowed us quickly. Street vendors calling out prices. Buses grinding to a halt at crowded stops. The smell of rain-soaked concrete drifting in through the half-open window. I kept my hand pressed lightly to the inside of my jacket where the envelope rested. It was sealed with a wax stamp, her initials pressed into the crimson seal like a warning. Breaking it would feel like breaking something sacred. We'd been driving for about 20 minutes when the first problem appeared. A police checkpoint. It was set up in the middle of a stretch of road I knew well, a road that almost never had checkpoints. 4 uniformed men, orange cones, and an unmarked white van parked at an angle. One of the officers stepped forward, raising a hand. The driver slowed, pulled to the side. "Routine inspection," the man said, but his eyes didn't scan the driver. They locked on me. I noticed things immediately. His boots were wrong. Old, mud-caked, not regulation issue. His badge number spacing looked off, and the way his fingers twitched near his belt. He was tense. "Step out, sir," he said. I got out, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "Meeting a client," I said. "May I see your ID?" I handed it over, He studied it longer than necessary, then glanced at my jacket. "What's in the inside pocket?" "Wallet," I said, patting the opposite side first. "Here." He took it, opened it, flipped through, finding nothing of interest. His frown deepened. Before he could press further, a motorbike came tearing down the opposite lane, swerving dangerously close to the cones. The officer cursed, waving at the others to chase it. They piled into the van, sirens wailing as they sped off. The driver and I didn't wait. We were back on the road within seconds, my pulse still hammering. The city thinned into quieter streets, but tension clung to me like wet clothes. 15 minutes later, I spotted the second problem: a black sedan in the rearview mirror. At first I thought it was coincidence, until it mirrored every lane change we made. I told the driver to take a sharp right into a side street. The sedan followed. Another turn. Same result. "They're tailing us," I said quietly. The driver's knuckles whitened on the wheel. "Underground parking, 2 streets ahead," he murmured. We pulled in. The descent into the dim concrete space was slow, the sound of our tires echoing off the pillars. The sedan paused at the entrance, then rolled in. I got out and walked toward the far wall, pretending to check my phone. The sedan crept closer, its windows tinted black. I ducked behind a pillar, waiting. When it finally passed, I caught the driver's profile. Sharp jaw, slicked hair, and recognition hit me. He was one of the executives, whose photo I'd seen in her private room. So the hunt wasn't hypothetical. Harold Mensa's building rose from the street like an old sentinel. Stone walls, brass fixtures, a faint scent of polished wood even from the lobby. The security guard at the front checked my name, then waved me through. Upstairs, Harold was waiting. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a perfectly pressed gray suit. His handshake was firm, his gaze steady. "You have something for me?" he asked once the door was closed. I handed him the envelope. He didn't open it. He just studied me, like he was measuring my worth. "You came alone?" I nodded. That was wise. He placed the envelope in his desk drawer, locking it with a small key. "Tell her she chose well." I wanted to ask what exactly was inside, but some part of me knew I didn't want the answer. The drive back should have felt lighter, but it didn't. If anything, the streets felt different, like the city had shifted while I was upstairs. People glanced longer. Conversations hushed as we passed. Maybe I was just on edge, but every shadow seemed to watch me. By the time we reached the mansion, the daylight was fading. The gates opened slowly, but the usual sense of quiet order was gone. The driver stopped near the entrance. I got out, expecting to see her waiting in the hall. She wasn't. The front door was slightly open. Inside, the lights were dim, and the air was still. Too still. "Hello?" my voice echoed. I walked through the hall, past the lounge, into the corridor that led to her office. The reinforced door, the one that had been closed and guarded yesterday, now stood wide open. The corkboards, the files, the photographs, gone. Not scattered, not in disarray, gone. Removed with deliberate precision. On the desk, a single sheet of paper. 4 words written in her unmistakable hand. "Don't trust anyone. D." She was gone. No explanation, no sign of where she'd gone, and the only thing she'd left me was a warning that made my chest tighten. Because now, if I couldn't trust anyone, I was truly alone. The guard said she left without telling anyone where she was going. The warning note still lay on her desk, the ink fresh enough that it hadn't fully dried. I stood staring at it for a long time, my fingers itching to pick it up, my mind racing to decide whether that would somehow make things worse. The air in the mansion felt wrong. Too still, too quiet. I stepped out into the hall and called for one of the guards. A man in a black suit, tall, broad-shouldered, expressionless, appeared almost immediately. "Where is she?" I asked. His gaze flicked briefly toward the open office door, then back to me. "She left." "When?" "About an hour ago." "And she didn't say where she was going?" He shook his head. No instructions. No destination. Just told us not to follow. I felt a twist in my stomach. That wasn't like her. Every move she made was deliberate, calculated. Leaving without telling anyone? That screamed trouble. I headed for the main entrance, my footsteps echoing on the marble. Another guard stood near the door. "You didn't stop her?" I asked sharply. "She said she needed privacy," he replied. Her tone made it clear we should stay out of it. The words were reasonable on the surface, but my gut screamed they were wrong. She wouldn't vanish like this unless she had no choice, or unless someone had forced her hand. The thought I'd been avoiding crept in, cold and unwelcome. What if this wasn't voluntary? What if the people who had been tailing me earlier had her? I pulled out my phone and tried her number. It rang twice before going straight to voicemail. I sent a short text. "Where are you? Are you okay?" No reply. I paced the length of the hall, running through possibilities. Maybe she'd gone to meet a contact. Maybe she was setting up the next move. But deep down, I knew. The suddenness of it, the lack of communication. This wasn't part of the plan. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I opened the message. "Stay out of this or you'll regret it." No name, no punctuation. Just the kind of direct, ice-cold threat you don't misinterpret. I stared at the words, my pulse quickening. Whoever sent it knew I'd noticed she was gone. That meant they were close enough to watch me. Maybe even inside the mansion. The smart thing would be to listen. Pretend I'd seen nothing. Keep my head down. But then I thought of her in that first meeting, saying she could only trust me. I thought of the weight of the envelope she'd handed me, the risk she'd taken in involving me at all. Number. Backing off wasn't an option. If she was in trouble, I was already part of it, whether I liked it or not. I started with the security office. The two guards inside stiffened when I walked in, as if unsure whether to stop me. "I want the gate camera footage from the last 2 hours," I said. They hesitated. "She trusted me," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "You think she'd want you hiding this from me?" One of them finally turned to the screen. The footage rewound, the black and white images flickering until they froze on her stepping through the front door. She wore a dark coat I hadn't seen before, her hair tied back, sunglasses covering her eyes. She didn't wait for a car. She walked past the gate and disappeared from the frame. "No driver?" I asked. "No," the guard confirmed. "She went alone." I rewound again, slower this time, scanning for anything unusual. And there it was, a figure leaning against the far wall outside the gate, just barely visible. Too far for me to see a face, but their posture. Patient. Waiting. When she passed them, they pushed off the wall and followed. The guard froze the frame. "Can you zoom in?" I asked. The image blurred, but enough detail emerged. A man in a dark jacket, hand in pocket, keeping a measured distance. My stomach tightened. I left the mansion and took a taxi into the city. If she'd been walking, she wouldn't have gone far before getting into a car or meeting someone. I started tracing streets around the area, scanning for any sign of her. An hour passed, then another. The winter light began to fade, the sky bleeding into the deep blue of evening. I was about to call it for the night when I noticed something at the far end of a narrow side road. A familiar shape, her car. It was parked half on the curb, the driver's side door slightly ajar. I moved toward it slowly, every step deliberate. The street was quiet, too quiet. A couple of boarded-up storefronts, a single flickering street lamp, the distant hum of traffic somewhere far away. The car was definitely hers, same sleek black body, same silver trim, but there was no one inside. The driver's seat was pushed back, as if someone taller than her had been there. The keys weren't in the ignition. On the passenger seat, a single leather glove. Hers. I'd seen her wear it before. Soft brown leather with a tiny gold button at the wrist. I picked it up. The leather was cold, stiff from the chill air. I stepped back, scanning the surroundings. That was when I saw the building across the street. An old warehouse, its windows dark, its brick walls stained from years of neglect. The loading bay door hung crooked, rust eating at the edges. Something about it made the hair on my neck rise. This wasn't a random place to abandon a car. If she'd been forced here, this building was the most obvious destination. I stood there for a long moment, the street lamp buzzing faintly above me. My phone was still in my pocket, but calling anyone now felt like the wrong move. If they'd taken her here, I might only have one chance to find her before they moved her again. And if I waited for help, that chance could vanish. I crossed the street slowly, my eyes on the shadowed entrance of the warehouse. Somewhere inside, I felt certain the answers and the danger were waiting, and I was about to step into both. I stepped inside the warehouse, and everything I thought I knew shattered. The cold hit me first. It wasn't the kind of cold you feel in your bones from weather. This was the stale, unmoving chill of a place that had been abandoned for years. The kind where dust just hangs in the air like fine ash, and every breath tastes faintly of rust and damp concrete. The door groaned on its hinges as I eased it open. My fingers tightened on the edge of the frame, careful not to let it slam back. The dim light inside seemed to swallow the street lamp glow from outside, pulling me into a hollow, cavernous dark. The sound of my own breathing was too loud. I waited. Somewhere deeper in the warehouse, faint voices echoed. Low, clipped, deliberate. The words blurred into an indistinct hum, but the tone was unmistakable. Negotiation. And tension. I slid along the wall, my shoes crunching over grit and glass. Every step felt like it would give me away, so I paused after each one, letting the sound settle before moving again. A line of wooden crates sat half-collapsed ahead, their corners splintered, nails sticking out like jagged teeth. I crouched behind them, peering through a gap between two boards. That's when I saw her. She was standing in a pool of pale light leaking through a gap in the ceiling, facing 3 men. She had changed. Gone was the beige coat, replaced by a dark-fitted jacket and jeans. Her hair was tied back, revealing sharp lines of focus in her face. Yesterday in the shelter she'd seemed fragile, not weak, but weathered. Here she looked like someone carved out of steel. The man directly in front of her was broad, bald, with a jaw like a block of granite. He paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, voice a low growl. "You think we're fools," he said. Her answer came without a flicker of hesitation. "I think you're smart enough to know a deal that saves you more than it costs." The 2 other men shifted at her words. One leaned against a rusted pillar, arms crossed, eyes scanning the shadows. The other stood still, watching her like a hawk sizing up prey. The bald man stopped pacing, turned to face her squarely. "You're asking for time. Time costs money. Every day your company's shares drop, we bleed more." "You won't bleed if I stop the fall," she said, voice steady. "And I will. But if you take over now, you inherit a disaster. Half your contracts will vanish. Your new asset will become a liability overnight." I felt my brow knit. She wasn't protecting herself. She was protecting the company, protecting the people in it. The bald man chuckled darkly. "You talk big for someone one bad headline away from collapse." She stepped closer, closing the distance until they were less than a meter apart. "I talk like someone who knows the board will cave if you pressure them, but not if I'm standing in the way. You came here to strong-arm me. I came here to make sure you walk out seeing me as leverage, not dead weight." The man leaned in slightly, voice dropping. "And what if I decide leverage is easier to remove?" That was the first time her voice sharpened. "Then you'll have more enemies than you can afford. And I'm not talking about me." It was a dangerous play. I could feel it even from where I was hidden. But it worked. The man straightened, stared at her for a long moment, then said, 72 hours. That's it." She nodded once. 72 is all I need. The men moved toward a side exit, boots thudding against the concrete. She stood still until they disappeared, then exhaled, the kind of release you give when you've been holding your breath for too long. I thought she'd head for the main door, but instead she turned toward a narrow hallway along the far wall. It was dark, the kind of dark that swallows you whole if you're not careful. I followed, keeping my steps light. The hallway smelled different, older, mustier, with an undercurrent of motor oil and mold. Rusted lockers lined one side, many hanging open with their doors warped and bent. A faint drip echoed somewhere overhead, marking time in a slow, steady rhythm. She reached a small room at the end, barely more than a storage closet, and stepped inside. "Close the door," she said. Her voice didn't carry surprise, just command. I hesitated. "You knew I was here?" She turned halfway, one eyebrow lifting. "From the moment you came in." I shut the door behind me. When she faced me fully, the calm from the negotiation was gone. Her eyes burned with controlled fury. "Do you have any idea how dangerous that was?" "I was looking for you," I said, trying to keep my voice low. "You shouldn't have." She moved closer, the sharp scent of metal and dust between us. "Those men would kill you just for being in the same building if they thought you were with me. What were you doing with them?" Her jaw tightened. "Buying time." "For the company?" "For the people in it," she corrected. "If they force a takeover now, hundreds will lose their jobs. Whole families will be wiped out financially. I can't let that happen." I studied her. "So you came here, without security, without backup, to cut a deal with them yourself? If I send anyone else, they'll think I'm hiding something. If I come alone, I control the story they hear. That's insane." "That's business when the stakes are life and death," she said sharply. Then softer. "You think the board would back me in this? They're the reason we're in trouble." The conviction in her voice was ironclad. She wasn't just fighting to save her position. She was fighting against the very people she supposedly led. She walked past me, crouched beside a collapsed shelf, and pulled out a small duffel bag. The zipper creaked as she opened it, revealing thick folders, sealed envelopes, and what looked like financial ledgers bound with string. "These," she said, "are why I can't fail in 72 hours. They're proof of fraud, embezzlement, everything the board's been covering up." "And you're keeping them here?" I asked, glancing around the decrepit room. "No one would think to look here," she said. "It's the last place they'd risk showing their faces." She zipped the bag closed and stood. "Go back to the mansion," she said. "Act like you never saw me here." I shook my head. "I'm not leaving you here alone." "This isn't a loyalty test, Daniel," she said, stepping closer until her voice was almost a whisper. "This is survival. If they know you're with me, you're dead." The finality in her tone left no space for argument. It wasn't drama. It wasn't exaggeration. It was a fact. And as her words sank in, the reality hit me harder than any boardroom politics ever could. I wasn't just tangled up in some high-stakes business game. I was standing in the middle of a war. Her hand was still on the duffel, her eyes locking with mine. "Leave now," she said, "if you want to live long enough to see how this ends." I didn't know if I could, but I knew if I stayed, everything might end before I got the chance to decide. We had one night to pull off the deal, or lose everything. The ride back to the mansion was silent, not the comfortable kind, but the heavy, loaded kind, where every second feels like a countdown. She sat beside me in the back of the SUV, duffel bag wedged between her feet, eyes fixed on the darkened streets as if she were memorizing every turn. I wanted to ask what exactly we were going to do next, but her jaw was set, her hands folded tightly in her lap. This wasn't the moment. When we finally reached the driveway, the guards opened the gates without a word. The mansion's lights spilled across the stone path, and for a moment, it felt like we'd driven out of one world and into another. We stepped inside, and she headed straight to the study. "Daniel, she said without looking back. Follow me. Inside, she dropped the duffel on the table and unzipped it. The folders came out in stacks, each labeled with a date and a name. She spread them out like cards in a game neither of us could afford to lose. This, she said, is our ammunition. I took a seat across from her, scanning the papers. This is proof of what you told me in the warehouse? She nodded. More than proof. This is leverage, enough to take down 3 board members, 2 executives, and 1 very dangerous partner. And we're using it tonight. Her eyes lifted to mine. We don't have a choice. They're meeting tomorrow morning to finalize the takeover. If we don't force their hand before then, the company is gone, and so are the jobs of 800 employees. It was insane. But then again, so was everything since I'd given her that last piece of bread. What's the plan? I asked. She leaned forward, lowering her voice even though we were alone. There's a contract they need, one that secures a supply chain they can't replicate. The owner of that supply chain is in town tonight. If we convince him to sign with us instead, the takeover collapses. And I'm guessing the board doesn't know he's here. They think he's flying in tomorrow, she said with a faint smile. We're moving ahead of them. It sounded simple when she said it, but I knew better. So what's the catch? Several, she admitted. 1, he doesn't trust the board, and he barely knows me. 2, we have to reach him before they do. And 3, she tapped the papers. We have to make it worth his while without putting ourselves in legal ruin. I leaned back, thinking. You're going in as the CEO. That's expected. But if you bring someone who looks like just another executive, he'll lump you in with the rest of them. She tilted her head. Go on. I'm the wild card, I said. I don't look like I belong in those boardrooms, and that's the point. You let me do most of the talking at first. Make it personal before it's professional. Her smile grew sharper. Street, smarts, and desperation, I added. People can smell it, and sometimes they respect it. We spent the next hour preparing. She gave me a crash course in the finer points of the deal. Numbers, supply routes, clauses buried deep in contracts. I committed as much as I could to memory, but I knew my real job wasn't to out-talk a businessman. It was to make him believe we were worth betting on. By midnight, we were ready. The hotel where he was staying was the kind of place where the walls seemed to absorb noise. Even the lobby was quiet, the air faintly scented with something expensive I couldn't name. We approached the front desk. She gave her name, and the receptionist's expression flickered. Not with recognition, but with that subtle alertness that meant a guest was about to be protected from an unscheduled visit. He's expecting us, she said calmly. A short call later, we were on the elevator to the penthouse. The man who opened the door was tall, lean, with silver hair and eyes that seemed to weigh every word you spoke. He wore a loose shirt and no shoes, but somehow he looked more in control than most people did in full suits. We stepped inside. He didn't waste time. You're here to talk me into signing with you before tomorrow. No, I said before she could speak. His brow rose. We're here, I continued, because you've been lied to, and because she's the only one in this city who isn't going to treat you like a lifeline she can squeeze dry. For the first time, his gaze shifted fully to me. And you are? Someone who has nothing to gain if you sign, but everything to lose if you don't. For the next 15 minutes, we told him the truth. About the board, about the fraud, about the jobs on the line. She slid the folders across the table one by one, letting him skim just enough to see the weight of the evidence. Then I told him about me, about the bread, about how I'd watched her risk everything in a warehouse full of men who could have killed her just to buy time for the company. He listened without interrupting. When we finished, he leaned back, steepling his fingers. You're asking me to step into a fire, he said. No, she replied. I'm asking you to keep the fire from spreading to everything you've built. The silence that followed felt like an entire hour. Then, finally, he reached for a pen. I'll sign, he said, but only because I believe you're willing to burn with it if it comes to that. The contract was done in under 10 minutes. By the time we left the hotel, the city felt different. The streets were still dark, the air still cool, but there was something sharper in the night, like the world had tilted just slightly in our favor. She drove us straight to the mansion. Neither of us spoke much. We didn't need to. Morning came fast. The boardroom was already half full when we walked in. Conversations hushed as she took her seat at the head of the table. I stood near the wall, the contract in hand. One of the senior board members leaned forward. We've already begun discussions with the buyer. I don't see the point in... She slid the signed contract onto the table. The room went still. This, she said, renders your discussions irrelevant. The meeting that followed was brutal. The board scrambled, tried to poke holes in the agreement, but it was airtight. The hostile takeover was dead before it ever left the ground. When the dust settled, she rose from her chair and looked around the table. Since some of you seem to have forgotten what loyalty looks like, she said, allow me to reintroduce it to you. She turned to me. Meet your new vice president. The room erupted, some in shock, some in protest, and a few with smiles they couldn't quite hide. Me? I just stood there, wondering how a single act of kindness in a shelter had brought me to this moment. All it took was one act of kindness to change my life forever. The city skyline glowed in the evening light, all gold and glass. From my office window, the streets looked like thin rivers of light, cars snaking through the city I once thought was too big for me. My name gleamed in silver letters on the frosted glass door. Daniel Okafor, Vice President. Sometimes I'd catch my reflection in that glass and still not believe it was me. The same man who once counted coins for bus fare, now making decisions worth millions. And yet, every time I looked at that title, I saw more than just the letters. I saw a piece of bread. Not just any bread, the last bread I had, on the day she walked into that roadside shelter. It's strange how memory works. You forget birthdays, faces, whole months of your life, but certain moments stay sharp forever. That day, I'd been cold, tired, and desperate. My rent was overdue, my stomach was empty, and my hope was slipping. I thought keeping that bread for myself would be the only sensible choice, but something in her eyes stopped me. And now, here I was, in an office high above the city, in a suit that fit me better than any I'd ever worn, because of that choice. The early days as vice president were a blur of meetings, decisions, and whispered politics. The board didn't fully accept me at first. Some saw me as her project, a gamble they couldn't control. Others thought I'd fade into the background, grateful just to be here. They were wrong. I had been on the bottom long enough to know what it feels like when nobody listens, when your work is invisible. I knew the faces of the employees who ate lunch alone, who hid pay slips in their pockets, who wore the same shoes until the soles gave out. So I made them my priority. It started small. Quiet initiatives no one could block. We set up a fund for employees facing emergencies. We arranged free meals for late-night workers. We offered scholarships to the EOI, children of staff who couldn't afford school fees. I didn't announce these changes in grand speeches. I didn't want applause. I wanted trust. And slowly, I saw it growing. In the way people met my eyes in the hall, in the notes left on my desk, in the quiet nods from staff who once avoided speaking up. One night, she called me into her office after everyone else had gone. "You've been busy," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes warm. "I've just been doing what I think is right," I replied. "That's why I chose you," she said, leaning back in her chair. "Money builds companies, but people keep them alive. Never forget that even with all the success, there was a part of me that couldn't move forward without looking back." The shelter where we'd met wasn't far from the company's main building. Sometimes, after late meetings, I'd ask the driver to take a detour past it. It still looked the same, cracked roof, broken benches, flickering light on the corner. And still, people gathered there. People with tired faces, holding everything they owned in plastic bags. People who looked at passing cars like they were watching another world. Every time I saw them, I felt that pull, a reminder of how close I had come to staying there forever. On a Friday afternoon, after finalizing a deal that secured hundreds of jobs for the next 5 years, I made a decision. Instead of going home, I asked the driver to stop at a bakery. The warm smell of fresh bread hit me the second I stepped inside. I bought every loaf they had: soft white bread, crusty rolls, sweet buns dusted with sugar. The bakery staff stared, surprised, as I loaded bag after bag into the car. We drove to the shelter, and I stepped out carrying enough bread to feed everyone there. Heads turned. Conversations stopped. I didn't make a speech. I didn't tell them who I was. I just started handing it out. "To you," I said, placing a loaf into a man's rough, cold hands. "For your kids," I told a woman holding a toddler. "Eat well tonight," I said to a young boy sitting on the curb. Some people looked at me with suspicion at first, like they were waiting for a catch. But bread is simple. Bread needs no explanation. As I gave out the last loaf, a young man about my age stopped me. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I looked at him for a long moment. He had the same weary eyes I'd once had, the same thin frame of someone who skipped more meals than he could afford. "Because once, someone gave me bread when I needed it most," I said. "And it changed everything." He didn't understand. Not yet. But maybe one day he would. The following Monday, she called me into her office. "I heard about your little trip to the shelter," she said, a hint of a smile playing at her lips. I just thought, it's where everything began. I don't want to forget it. "Good," she said simply. "Because power makes it easy to forget." She paused, then added, "And forgetting is the first step toward losing yourself." Over the months that followed, I learned something she'd known all along. Kindness wasn't just charity. It was strategy. It built loyalty that no paycheck could buy, inspired effort that no threat could force. We built a culture where helping each other wasn't extra work. It was part of the job. Where staff who got promoted reached back to pull others up. The company grew stronger, not just in profit, but in spirit. Now, when I walk through the lobby, I see more smiles than I used to. I see junior clerks laughing with department heads. I see security guards greeted by name. And sometimes I see my younger self, in the interns, in the delivery drivers, in the tired receptionist just trying to make it through another shift. When I do, I remember that my job isn't just to keep my position. It's to make sure the next Daniel, who walks through these doors, never feels invisible. Sometimes, the smallest choice you make is the one that changes everything. Don't scroll away now, because the real heart of this story hasn't even hit you yet. What's coming will shake you, inspire you, and maybe even change you. Stay with me, right to the last second, and I promise, you'll feel every beat of what kindness can truly do.